Hey, welcome to lesson 9. We're going to continue talking about the age of imperialism. Again, talking about imperialism in Africa, focusing on African resistance movements. Last lesson, we talked about the scramble for Africa, and during the scramble for Africa, European countries raced to claim and occupy territory in Africa as colonies. And they would use these colonies to benefit themselves by becoming economically more powerful and gaining prestige. However, the natives suffered, commonly dying from disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, outright murder, and natives, for the most part, just lost their independence and their culture and their way of life. So this led to a lot of resistance movements where Africans would resist colonization against the Europeans. And some resistance movements had early success where they won battles against the Europeans, but most all of these resistance movements ultimately failed due to European countries bringing in reinforcements and having more advanced weapons such as the Maxim machine gun. By the end of the scramble for Africa, nearly all of Africa will be colonized by Europe, with the main exception being Ethiopia. So Ethiopia was able to maintain their independence using resistance against the European countries, particularly Italy, and they defeated Italy in the First Italo-Ethiopian War. We'll talk more about that later. Liberia also maintained their independence, though not through a resistance movement, but more from support from the United States, in which the United States was hoping to send ex-slaves back to Africa and set up colonies for them there. Even though almost all of these resistance movements were unsuccessful, with the one exception being Ethiopia, some resistance movements lasted for several years before being put down. In France, or not in France, but France fought against the resistance fighters for 50 years in Algeria, from 1830 to 1884, and the Mandingo resistance from 1888 to 1898 for 15 years in French West Africa. Britain fought against the Boers and the Zulus in South Africa, on and again and off again for a long time, including the Anglo-Zulu War, the First Boer War, and the Second Boer War. Britain also fought against resistance movements in Sudan and had a 20-year battle against the Dervish Resistance, which we'll talk about more later. Germany was known as particularly violent and ruthless during the age of imperialism. They did not start setting up colonies until later than the other European countries, and they continued to wage war, oftentimes against the resistance movements long after they had been put down. And we're talking about the Hereros and the Maji resistance movements in German colonies. So I'll go into more detail on the Dervish Resistance. Once again, this was a resistance movement mainly against the British influence in East Africa, although they also fought against the Italians and the Ethiopians. They were eventually defeated by the British, but the Dervish movement and the Dervish resistance lasted for over 20 years. In fact, were not actually stopped until after World War I. The Dervish movement was sparked by Muhammad Abdullah Hassan. He was a Somali nationalist and Islamic militant leader. He recruited Muslim soldiers from across the Horn of Africa. And if you look at the map here, you can see where the Horn of Africa is in Africa. It is up here, the little red part of Africa. And it is called the Horn of Africa because it looks kind of like a rhinoceros's horn, and it juts out into the Indian Ocean. Now, this was a key point for Europeans because they wanted to control this area to give them kind of port cities and have trading posts go back and forth between Asia and Europe. Hassan wanted to ensure the independence of the African people, and by recruiting these Muslim soldiers, he started basically a jihad against the European influences in the Horn of Africa and hoping to drive out the European imperialists completely out of Africa. And he also wanted to defeat the Ethiopians, who he feels sided with the Europeans. His ultimate goal was to drive out the Europeans and then create an independent Muslim nation in Africa. The Dervish movement did come to an end after over 20 years, when they were defeated by the British after World War I, and the British brought in airplanes to help them defeat the Dervish movement. In the end, nearly one-third of the population of Somaliland died due to these wars, and also wars between rival clans that took place during the same time. The Hereros Wars was actually an act of genocide by the Germans against the people living in modern-day Namibia. This took place in the German colony of German Southwest Africa, and is now considered genocide. And you can see in a picture here, the dark blue-green would be German Southwest Africa. The rebellion began in 1904 when the Herero rebels massacred more than 100 German men, sparing the women and children. These German men were living in German Southwest Africa as what started up as a small colony and was quickly growing in power, and they started to discriminate against the natives living there and really restricting some of their rights, and this led to the uprising. The Hereros formed coalitions with other tribes and began using guerrilla warfare tactics against the Germans, where they would surprise attack and then retreat into the abyss, and a place where the Germans didn't know where they were coming from or where they went, using their knowledge of the natural environment and terrain to their advantage. Eventually, Germany's going to have to send in 20,000 German troops into the region to put down a rebellion. Only about 3,000 of these actually saw combat. And despite being outnumbered 5-1, Germany did defeat the Hereros and their allies at the Battle of Waterberg, and this was mostly due to superior weaponry, the Maxim machine gun, heavy artillery, and overall better rifles. Germany drove the remaining rebels into the desert, where most of them died from dehydration. Even though the rebellion was put down, the war continued when the German general who was sent to put down a rebellion issued an extermination order against the Herero people, demanding that they kill every Herero man and drive the women and children into the desert. This lasted for a couple months before the extermination order was suspended, and instead they rounded up the surviving Herero people and imprisoned them in concentration camps, where the majority of them still died from disease, exhaustion, abuse, sometimes outright murder, and we're also talking about medical experiments. Germany ended up setting up 5 concentration camps in German Southwest Africa. Probably the most famous is Shark Island concentration camp. It was nicknamed Death Island. Here they performed medical experiments on the prisoners and was considered by many to be not just a concentration camp, but also a death camp or an extermination camp. They would take the people who died and oftentimes take their skulls, their bones, and other parts of their bodies and perform medical experiments on them, sometimes perform medical experiments on them while they were still alive. One thing that would happen they would take the people that would die or were killed, and they would boil their heads in hot water and force the women and children, the Herero women and children, to do this, sometimes with their own relatives being who they were doing this to. And then they would actually have to peel off the skin that was remaining after boiling the head and send these to Germany, where they could perform medical experiments. Now, most of these medical experiments were actually the early stages of Nazi eugenics and the idea that trying to prove that German people were superior to African people, and really starts kind of a springboard for the Nazi beliefs that are going to take place and take over Germany during the 1930s and 40s. Well, until recently, the human remains, the skulls, and other bones of the human experiments were actually on display in Germany. Also, they were on display in the American Museum of Natural History. Some of these remains have been sent back to Namibia to be given a proper burial. And there's this kind of fight on what to do with the other ones. Some people in Germany want to continue to keep these as a display of what happened, whereas other people want these remains to be sent back to Namibia to be buried. And there's a lot of push for Germany to have to pay reparations and do other things, such as apologize to the Herero people for these actions. This is the first genocide of the 1900s, and even though the rebellion only lasted for a few months before Germany put it down, the concentration camps continued until 1908, and about 80% of the entire Herero population died as a result of the genocide. Things weren't much better in Maji Maji. In fact, they were probably just as bad. German occupation in German East Africa, a colony in modern-day Tanzania, was particularly violent, and the African leaders were murdered, for non-compliance, and the general population was enslaved and forced to grow cotton, which was a cash crop for Germany that they'd export throughout Europe and the world to gain a lot of money, and they made them grow cotton instead of actually growing food for survival. They also forced the people to build roads for Germany, and if they did not comply, there would be vicious forms of punishment against the African population. The Africans in German East Africa formed resistance movements where over 20 different ethnic groups joined together, hoping to defeat the Germans by working together and gain back their freedom. The main problem they're going to face is Germany still has much more advanced weapons. So during a drought, a prophet claimed that sacred water, translated as Maji Maji, sprinkled on their bodies would turn the German bullets into water and protect the African resistance fighters from the German army. And this is where the Maji Maji uprising gets its name. The fighters also believed that the war was a holy war ordained by God, and that their ancestors returned to life to assist in their struggle. So this also turns into a jihad, holy war for the Muslims. Well, the Maji Maji was put to a test. They sprinkled themselves in water, the sacred water called Maji Maji, and as African resistant fighters attacked the German machine gun post, where they were mowed down by the thousands. Now, eventually, the African resistance fighters are going to go back and resort to guerrilla warfare, similar to what you saw in the other rebellion we talked about with the Herero Wars, but this original thing was not successful. The resistance fighters were mostly armed with spears, and they did have some guns, but these guns were highly outdated and could only fire about one bullet every 3 minutes, so they weren't very useful at all. After the rebellion was put down, Germany started a counter-offensive against the natives living in German East Africa. They burned villages, they destroyed crops of people who were suspected to support the Maji Maji, and according to German reports, 75,000 resistance fighters died in combat, whereas over twice that many died from disease and famine as a result of their crops being destroyed. Last thing we're going to talk about is the First Italo-Ethiopian War. Ethiopia actually defeated Italy during this war, and it was the only African nation to successfully resist European imperialists in order to maintain their independence, although Liberia maintained their independence as well, but not through resistance. This all started, like most of them, through a disputed treaty where they signed an agreement that was not on the up and up. They had them sign two things, and what they signed was not what the Europeans said they signed. So they signed this agreement, and Italy, and Italians claimed that this turned all of Ethiopia into an Italian colony. When the Italians sends their troops to occupy Ethiopia, Menelik, the emperor of Ethiopia, declares war on Italy, and Ethiopia actually had the advantage pretty much the whole time. They had a numerical advantage, they had better weapons, and they were also supported by Russia and France. And before the war, Ethiopia, under the leadership of Menelik, had modernized its army, purchasing weapons from Russia and France, which Russia and France was not supposed to do, according to the Berlin Conference. But Italy was not very modernized. They were a relatively new country, only about 20 to 30 years old at this point. Their army was equipped with outdated weapons, and they were at a huge disadvantage and eventually defeated at the Battle of Ottawa. And this gives Ethiopia their independence. They continue to stock guns and weapons and modernize their army to fend off potential new threats. And they're going to maintain their independence throughout the age of imperialism, all the way up until the mid-1930s, where leading into World War II. Next unit, we're continue with the, we're kind of wrap things up with talking